Go ahead.
Oh, hey, hi, this is Pam Garrettson. I'm a biologist with the Division of Migratory Bird Management in U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service down in Laurel, Maryland. Today, it's the 100th year of bird banding, the bird banding lab in North America in the United States. And I just want to step you over a little bit of history about the last century of bird banding. And I've concentrated on how we use the data, because I think that's the first and foremost thing, but I am going to cover some techniques. It's a lot to cover. If you have questions or things I didn't cover, I'm going to leave time for questions, but I would invite you to contact me later by email, or I've been on the Discord chat also, so please feel free to contact me for any additional information. Thanks for being here. Okay, yeah, we can go to the next screen. So I'm going to start out in an unusual way, but needing to thank the USGS Patuxent Bird Banding Lab, because they are actually the folks who do all the work. They have great staff, but in particular, Tony Silas Murillo and Chelsea Steinbrecher Hoffman have been in charge of trying to do some celebrations for the 100th year anniversary. Now, in a lot of things, it's had to be scaled back, but we're doing the best that we can. We really want to give some homage to people who've gone before us. Also, acknowledging the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and USGS communications teams, Valerie Fellows, Chris Dietz, and Jessica Fitzpatrick, and then again, all the folks who've gone before us. So just to give you an overview, I'm going to sort of talk about how we currently use banding data, and it has multiple uses. Some are very simple, some involve really complex models. I'm not going to go into a great deal about the math of the models, but basically here's some of the main ones. And again, we're thinking about what folks knew back in 1920, and so migration routes and distributions weren't known then. Bird banding lab is really useful for getting maximum lifespan, survival. Often in combination with other data, you can estimate population size. And I'm going to say up front, a lot of what I'm talking about is going to be on game species, harvested species, because for all our uses of banding data, you put these bands out on these birds, but you don't really get any information back unless at least some banded birds are going to be encountered, whether a live recapture by banders, a dead re-encounter by hunters, or either resighting data from the general public or sort of a non-game bird who has natural mortality, you happen to find it. But that's a very rare case. So for that reason, a lot of what we're going to talk about today is work on hunted species. Okay. Next slide. So Frederick Charles Lincoln was the first U.S. bird banding lab chief. In 1916, the U.S. federal government signed a treaty with several countries, most notably Canada, Mexico, I think it's Japan, Russia, and I may be missing one. I think it might be the Netherlands because of Greenland. Actually, okay, I'm not sure about that last one, but because of that treaty, because birds cross international boundaries, the federal government becomes involved. And then in 1918, there was the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which gave the federal government the ability to regulate take of migratory birds. So you can't take birds and focus again on hunting mortality without a permit. You have to have a license. You can't mess with birds unless you have a permit. So Mr. Lincoln was, they called on him. He's a biologist from Colorado, and they said, if we're going to manage migratory birds, we've got to know a little bit about them. And so you can see some early pictures of him here. And I mean, he's starting almost from zero. There were some bird banding done in North America starting in 1902. I think the Smithsonian had started banding black-crowned night herons, but and it was done by the American Birding Association, Bird Banding Association. But the bottom line is they were getting out of that business, and the government was taking over, and they needed to come up with an organized system. So, you know, figuring out what size of bands go on what birds, figuring out how to band them, what kind of pliers do you need, how do you handle them safely, how do you catch them, and then once you get back to the office, like Mr. Lincoln is doing there, how do you figure out a system for keeping track of the banding data and then also the encounter data? So whoever banders or the general public who might encounter these birds, how do you keep track of that? So Mr. Lincoln ended up being the bird banding lab chief from 1920 to 1946. He ended up having like 250 publications. And again, writes this, he wrote a book on couple books on the migration of birds, the manual for bird banders, that is, you know, how are we going to catch these things? How are you going to handle them? What sizes are you going to use? And then here's another paper down in the lower right-hand corner, calculating the abundance of waterfowl on the basis of band returns. And we're going to swing back around because turns out what's old can be new. So, and then the other thing was, when we're talking about migration, how do you classify that? How do you administer birds across a very large nation? But based on, you want to try to base that on the biology of the bird. So we can go ahead to the next slide. Okay, sorry, I was getting ahead of myself here, but again, so you've got the data and you're banding or you're marking individually very small birds to very large birds in different habitats. They have different needs. You can see on the upper right-hand corner, this Caspian tern is wearing color bands, and also this Canada goose is wearing a neck collar. So this would be more for studies where you're trying to get live visual resightings of these individuals. At Northern Parula, on the upper left, most of their encounters are going to come from bird banders that are banding year after year after year to get either their own birds back or sometimes birds from other stations. Okay, next slide. So yeah, as I mentioned, so what types of bands? Well, you can see, first of all, obviously they're round, so they can go around a bird's leg, their tarsus, the lower part, right above the foot or the web. And so most of them are butt end bands. So literally, so if you look furthest to the further, like some of the middle one, most of the ones there are butt end bands. And they just you'd simply open the band, fit it carefully around the bird's tarsus, and then close it very carefully. And so there's no gap in between. You want that band to be perfectly round so it can spin freely. It's not going to, it's going to have minimal impact on the bird. It's not going to get snagged on anything. And then you can see there's an individual unique number, the prefix and the suffix. The prefix, the last number on the prefix indicates the band size. And then again, all these bands that are given out and permit, you know, you have to have a banding permit to do this. You're responsible for not only banding the birds, but keeping track of your data. And then you can see here on the right-hand side, that is a hummingbird band. So the just retired chief of the bird banding lab, Bruce Peterjohn, is an avid hummingbird bander, and that's just very specialized. There's not very many people who can do that. And then you see those bands on the bottom to the left, that's for raptors, all the raptors except for eagles. The one on the right is for eagles. They have very strong beaks and sometimes talons and could easily rip them off. So those are actually closed with, you can see there's little holes on those tabs. Put those together and they actually rivet them together. Okay, next slide. So I mentioned that one of the things that Frederick Charles Lincoln did was establish general migration routes. And this is for waterfowl. And you can just see that, okay, the Atlantic, Pacific, so the Atlantic, Mississippi, Central, and then Pacific flyways are marked there. And again, they are separated into administrative flyways. And various state agencies work in cooperation with the federal government. We also work with the Canadian Wildlife Service up in Canada, and we'd like to be able to work more with Mexico, but some of the political situation, it's depending on that, it's sort of up and down. And also we have a biologist who's working a lot in the Caribbean. So what else do I want to let you know about that? Also, I should mention that the Canadian bird banding office started in 1923. So throughout the last century, we've worked really closely with the Canadians on a lot of levels, which is great. Next slide. So relative to migration routes, you can also kind of drill it down to a smaller level. This is American black duck. You can see the orange where it breeds and sort of breeds and winters or migration in the purple, and then wintering along just the more southern mid-Atlantic down to southern, mostly coastal, as you'll see in a minute. So from bird banding, next slide. So from bird banding data, we can kind of drill that down. So on the left are birds that are banded at Moosehorn National Wildlife Refuge, and hopefully you can see that green dot. That's where their banding location is. And then on the right are ones that are banded at Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge, and that's over in New York. And it's sort of in the middle of that clump, but you can hopefully see that green dot. You can see the ones that are banded at Moosehorn really have a very coastal distribution. Again, these are going to mostly be direct recoveries. That is, birds that are recovered in the same year they were banded from hunters who have harvested them. So that just sort of helps you, if necessary, because birds that are banded in different locations can have different survival rates, harvest rates, et cetera. So you can use these data to sort of drill down and figure out, if appropriate, how to manage birds on a smaller scale. Back in Mr. Lincoln's day, they're just getting started on figuring out where birds are migrating or where their ranges are. But we have situations now where various kinds of birds are expanding their ranges. Cattle egrets come to mind, and then recently the black-bellied whistling duck, which is was traditionally confined to Mexico and the southern part of Texas, they've been expanding into Louisiana. They've expanded some into Florida, Georgia, South Carolina. So folks have started studying these and banding data. Obviously, people are going to see these things too, and now people are more into bird watching. So you're going to have those data, but with banding data, you can get additional information. Also, on the right there, banding can be an educational experience. I'm sure this is the child of one of Paul. So Paul Link is doing the banding down there in Louisiana. Under supervision, though, children can get an opportunity to learn to handle birds appropriately and be involved and just see birds up close, which is cool. That said, to get a banding permit, it's not just for fun. You have to have a scientific purpose behind it. Next slide. Okay, so I can't give a talk about bird banding without talking about Wisdom, who is a Laysan albatross. She was first banded in 1956 by biologist Chandler Robbins out at Midway Atoll. She's the oldest documented banded bird ever, and as of 2019, she was still going strong and apparently hatched a chick. She successfully reared one for sure, I think back in 2016. So she survived tsunamis and all sorts of things, for longer than a lot of people live. Now, Chan Robbins, he just recently died, I think back in 2017 at the age of 98. He was coming into the office sometimes a couple of years even before that. But Chan, I saw a remark by him as saying, you know, look, now I'm walking with a cane. I don't see so great anymore, et cetera, but Wisdom, she's still looking pretty good and going strong. So hats off to her. Now, Wisdom, you can see she's wearing like a color marker band now, but apparently she's been banded like 6 times because these birds are in sandy habitats. They are out in the ocean for years at a time. So there's a couple things here. One, these birds, you're going to be able to get your hands back on individuals that they're living because they're breeding colonially. You may be able to recite them and keep track of them that way. But because of their long life and the conditions, the harsh conditions that they live in, Wisdom has had to have her bands replaced six times. So that can be, remember I said the bird banding lab has to keep track of all these data. When you replace a band, you've got to index all the bands that came before them to make that data useful. And that can be quite a challenge. I'm sorry, next slide. So this whole issue of band wear and how it relates to materials, I had talked to somebody on the chat last night or yesterday afternoon, and she said, well, what have you learned about different kinds of banding materials? This is a study I was involved in. So you see the aluminum bands are marked, and you can see how they wore much faster than the hard metal bands, the ankylloid bands. They're a combination of, I think, stainless steel, but other band materials combined. And you can see how much more quickly we were planning on following. We did follow these banded birds for at least 7 years, and we thought, okay, well, we need to do that. But we were startled to find that within 18 months, these lesser scaup and to a lesser extent redheads were experiencing extreme band wear on the aluminum bands to the point where people, you really couldn't read that number. Now, if people knew enough to send the bird band into the bird banding lab anyway to be etched, then they can like treat it with a mild acid, and it tends to make the numbers more visible so they can be read. But a lot of people don't know about that. Mike followed up with some of the hunters who and took pictures of some of these bands, and they said, look, if I saw like that aluminum band like on the right more totally smooth, I wouldn't have tried to report it. I wouldn't have known. So now I will say that the bird banding lab had recommended hard metal bands for lesser scaup and redheads for a number of years, but banders, it's a lot easier to put those aluminum bands on because the metal's so much softer. But scaup are like feeding at in these river deltas. They're probably rubbing their, just by they're paddling all the time. That sand and silt that's suspended in river deltas is probably wearing these out faster than we even knew. So it does turn out to be pretty important. Okay, next slide. So mark recapture models. I'm not going to go into a lot of the math on these, but there over the years many different models have been developed, but they're based on this principle of marking a sample of birds. And making assumptions that. So one of the main assumptions is that they're representative of the population of interest. Try to get various ages and sexes and birds that are throughout the distribution of the individual birds that are of interest. And like I said, you can get but they need to be re-encountered. At least they have to have some probability, decent probability of being re-encountered for this data to be useful. So you're getting live recaptures, like I said, resightings and dead recoveries. And then radio telemetry is another marking method, and those methods are becoming increasingly sophisticated and are probably going to be more and more useful for those smaller non-game species. For many years, the transmitters were just too big. to be useful, to be used on those small birds. A big step forward was the advent of computers for electronic data storage, and then for doing the estimating, like maximum likelihood estimation and fitting increasingly complex models became possible, practically possible with the advent of computers. So I want to talk about just really briefly another pioneer, a statistician named Cabell Brown. So a lot of probably the most in terms of estimating survival and recovery and harvest probabilities of hunted species, we use something called the Brownie model. And you're kind of like, what, a Brownie model? What is that? So that's her last name. She's a professor at NC State, and she she came up with she did work on some of that very early work. She concentrated on waterfowl, and the models that she worked on allow you to separate out harvest mortality from natural mortality with a little bit extra additional information. I didn't know what she looked like until I dug back in there. Of course, you know her name. Yeah, so I think this is okay, apologize. This is the first, this is the unedited, the uncorrected slideshow. We kind of went back and forth on this, but it's band recovery rate is going to just be the proportion of the number of banded birds that you recover in a given year versus the number of birds that were originally banded. And as like I said, the direct recovery is going to be the same year as it was banded. The indirect recoveries are going to be those recovered in subsequent years. Well, if you've got these direct and indirect recoveries, then you know, okay, I've got these many recovered here. You can begin to estimate the probability of survival, because if you recovered that second year, we know you survived that first year. And the precision of survival and recovery estimates, they increase with better samples of both bandings and recoveries. So I think we've already kind of covered a lot of this. One of the things we want to do is understand like what habitat conditions and kinds of harvest regulations are going to, what effect do those have on survival? Obviously, with habitat, it can be used to guide decisions about what land you want to acquire, what kind of management do you want to try to do on it to best help the birds. And then, of course, if you're going to have a hunted species, you don't when those birds are traditionally, if the bird populations are down, the hunting seasons become more conservative. So this has been key. And there's also this ongoing argument about, okay, is there a certain proportion of hunting mortality that essentially compensates for natural mortality? Or is it natural mortality, is the hunting mortality stacked on top of that? In other words, additive mortality. Next slide. So if everybody reported, if everybody who harvested or found a banded bird reported it to the bird banding lab, then the band reporting probability, the harvest probability, probability that a bird's going to get harvested during a given hunting season, that represented here by little h, is going to be equal to would just simply be equal to the band recovery rate. That is, if you had a band reporting rate of 1 or 100%. But people don't do that. And that probability has varied a whole lot over time. So we need to figure out a way to adjust that, especially if we wanted to look at longer time series of harvest probabilities. I should mention that the estimation of survival probability is really robust to changes in this band reporting probability. So it's not as much of an issue with survival estimation, but if you want to look at the effects of hunting, then you need to figure out how to convert these band recovery probabilities. And to do that, you got to figure out, okay, what are the humans doing now? This is like a human behavior issue that we're looking at right now. So yeah, what affects that human behavior? Well, in a lot of cases, so so for many, many years, for decades, in order to report a ban to the bird banning lab, you had to send a letter. And I think in some cases, they did require you to send the ban physically in. Some people don't want to send that ban in. Some people didn't know what to do. In some cases, if you're, say, a French-speaking person up in Canada, you go, I don't even know, even if I call, I may not get someone who speaks my language. I will say that both the Canadian Bird Banning Office has French-speaking biologists that folks can talk to, and the Bird Banning Lab in the U.S. also has folks who also speak Spanish, who are bilingual. So, but also it's a pain to just sort of write, pick up the phone, pick up a piece of paper, write a letter. And then because the ban inscriptions have been not super informative over the years, Avise, Washington, D.C., that's on a band along with this number, this unique number. But what does that tell you? I think they were trying to improve Spanish recovery, so Avise is sort of not quite grammatically correct, I think, but it's asking you, hey, give us a heads up on this. And they thought it was close enough to advise in English, but I don't think I would have known what to do with it. And then for a while, I think they had Washington, D.C., or they meant Washington, D.C. Biological Survey. But the joke is that maybe people were going to accidentally think, oh, this is what you do with a bird after you harvest it. You wash, boil, and serve. And then it complicated matters in that because ban reporting rates were probably pretty low, a lot of state agencies would just go out to public hunting areas and just stand there and ask everybody who came out of the field, did you get a banded bird? And they would go ahead and report them for it. So you had, to make this adjustment, you've got a lot of variability, and you're gonna have to make that adjustment a different way. And a lot of times people have assumed that solicited bans had a reporting probability of 1, but it wasn't an ideal way. So 1995, they started putting a 1-800 number on the bans, and they also obviously provided call centers or biologists could be called, and folks could just report over the phone. And then I think 2006, 2007, a web address was added. You had been able to report over the internet, but it wasn't really easy, so they tried to make it easier and began putting those inscriptions on the bans. So that helped. But again, we have to study humans here to figure out, well, what's the probability that they are going to report these bans? So one of the ways to do that is to band a certain proportion of the birds with you're double banding them. You're putting these green so-called money bands on there. They say they have it it's got a federal band on there, so it's got that inscription on it. So at least it gives them an idea of where to report it. But and then it's got this reward. And early studies back in when they were first made this change, or before they made this change, suggested that, hey, if you have a reward of $100, the proportion of people the probability that people are going to report it approaches 1. So then all you've got to do is just take your control band recovery probability, your reward band recovery probability, divided by your reward band recovery probability, and that's your band reporting rate. And this is some recent work that looks at band recovery probabilities that include those solicited bans over time. And you can see that huge jump around 1997 when the 1-800 number came into use. And then there's been a steady increase, and it's continued up through recently. Some unpublished data suggests that it's approaching 90%, and which is great. A couple reasons. I think that in addition to having inscription and the 1-800 number on it, around 96 or 97, that's really when people started using the internet. So if they got a banded bird, even if they had something with that old inscription, they could like search and say, well, I got a banded bird, what do I do with it? So I think that is in part, in part accounts for that very quick jump in the band reporting probability. And then now that people can easily get, now that people know what to do with their bands, they've sort of become, like I said, a real trophy. Folks will put them on their lanyard that holds their duck calls. I talked to a guy who told me he was getting married soon, and that he had designed his wedding ring to look like a bird band. So anyway. So we use this information in terms of managing wood ducks. Here's the male. They're very colorful. They breed throughout Eastern North America, but they're hard to survey from the air. So we wanted information on their harvest probabilities, their survival probabilities to better manage them. And fortunately, the banding data for wood ducks has been really good over the years. So with knowing these reporting probabilities, then we could take a look back at, hey, what have their harvest probabilities been overcome? Oh, this is not showing up like I'd hoped it would, but you can see the pink are, so up top are males. The juveniles tend to have higher harvest probabilities. You see where the harvest probability went down in the 80s. That is because at that point, the US was going through a drought, and the overall season lengths were set based on the conditions on the US and Canadian prairies. And because of that drought, populations were low, reproduction was low. And so we reduced the season length on wood ducks as well, just because it's set nationwide, and not surprisingly, their harvest probabilities dip. But these are the kinds of patterns we typically see: higher harvest, a little bit higher harvest on males, and generally higher harvest on juveniles. So I want to leave time for questions, so we'll kind of bop through this real quick. So another group of birds that can be difficult to assess the population on which you can, where it's difficult to assess their population size, are geese, especially those that breed in the Arctic, because it's such a vast area. And so recently, folks have been turning back to Mr. Lincoln's original idea, or a modification of an existing idea, on how to estimate abundance of populations. And so you can see that with those snow geese, probably Ross's geese mixed in there, up in the Arctic, they've actually got a helicopter up there. So if you were actually, so remote areas, some of these birds are just distributed over large areas, very difficult to survey from the air. So let's just take a look at the math on Mr. Lincoln's estimate. Again, I'm not going to dive deep into it. And I have to apologize. So I did correct this, but again, it didn't quite make it into it. So the first slide is correct. So it's basically just, it's based on this assumption. You're gonna sample, you're gonna capture birds on at least 2 occasions. And you make the assumption that the probability of being captured in that first instance equals the probability of being captured in the second instance that you do it. So then the total number of birds is going to equal the total number of birds you capture on that second, that are captured on that second time around, divided by the proportion of birds that are captured in the second time around. And so in the case of waterfowl, and I just need to tell you that, so that bottom equation, the big H, which stands for absolute total harvest, should be on the top, and the little h, which is our old friend harvest rate, should be on the bottom. So what you can do is, okay, you band a bird in July or August, and you make the assumption that there's going to be no deaths or bursts, and you can sort of set your harvest and harvest rate universes to be the same. And again, you may have to make some assumptions, and you want to try to not to violate them too badly. But you can say, all right, the hunting season is our second encounter period. And then it turns out, so for that big H, the total number of birds that potentially can be encountered, potential sample size of total birds harvested can be estimated from a separate survey, which is it's based on surveys of hunters, asking them how many birds they harvested in a given year, and then a subset of those harvested birds, they ask them to send the wings of the birds in so they can get species-specific harvest probabilities. So then you're just basically dividing that absolute harvest, big H, which should be on top there, but divided by the little h, the harvest rate. So turns out that Mr. Lincoln, we're still using, we're trying new techniques, trying to learn them, but we still get quite a lot of information from a centuries old technology, really sophisticated models for analyzing those data. But Mr. Lincoln, he had a lot of foresight. He was a pretty smart guy, and sort of swinging back around and utilizing one of his analysis techniques. Again, with a lot, estimates of variance and things like that we can do now. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. I think I can look down here in the question and answer, or I think I can do that. So I've seen mist nets for catching small songbirds. How do you actually catch the big waterfowl? Great question. A couple different ways. So one of those pictures of Paul catching those wood ducks, you saw them pulling, there was a light net that they had cast over a bunch of wood ducks. They basically put a bunch of bait out there, usually often it's corn or wheat. Get these ducks to get in a certain area, and then you actually have a rocket propelled net that you can detonate remotely that throws the net over those birds. You rush and you get the birds out of the net as quickly as possible, put them in those little crates, and then again, you're going to process them as quickly as possible, take the data that you need, get them banded, and get them back out on their way. Let's see. Yeah, are there any backyard banding programs? I would be interested in having the birds in my backyard banded, especially the purple martins, to see if the birds that go to Brazil come back to the same nesting site. So I think I said that they really try to have, they're trying to get gaps filled in current knowledge. So the first thing I would do would be to say, take a look at what programs have already been done on purple martins. And if you're interested in that, you can also potentially contact a researcher who's doing that. But it's going to be tough to get folks banding birds in your backyard. Now, one exception is hummingbirds. If you're getting hummingbirds in your backyard, I think Bruce is contacting people who've got feeders and things like that out. He's actually banding in people's backyards. A lot of the dove banders, so in that first slide, the gal in the blue shirt, the Blue Fish and Wildlife Service shirt, some people are banding mourning doves off their back decks, putting or in their backyards. So some people do band in their backyards. And then lastly, or what I'm seeing now here is with the whistling ducks, what sort of effects are we seeing with the expansion along the Gulf, or is it too early to tell? Right, so I think that's one of the things we're trying to figure out. We think they have fairly high survival probabilities. One question would be, so, they tend to be pretty aggressive. So I went with Paul banding wood ducks one day, and the landowner that accidentally scared them all off. So we were sitting there waiting to see if the wood ducks would come back so we could net them. And a pair of black-bellied whistling ducks came in, and they had a brood, and they were just kicking butt. Like, they were driving all the wood ducks away from the bait, and so we totally came up with a 0 that morning. So that's one of the things we're trying to figure out. Well, like I said, if that's those are all the questions that folks have. I really appreciate your attention and interest. And I think on that last slide, I do have, oh, right, do you have the contact information for the person banning hummingbird. I do get hummingbirds and doves in my backyard. So Bruce retired, and I do not currently know how to get in contact with him, and it may be, that might be by design. That said, I can certainly, if you email me, I think I put my email address on there, go ahead and just send me an email, and I'll see what I can do in terms of seeing if there's a need for that. And maybe you can, or possibly you could maybe tag along with somebody who's doing it in another area. Someone says, thank you very, very, very much. Yeah, thanks for your attention and time. Again, feel free to contact me. I've been on and off the Discord chat, so send me a message there if you want. Thank you so much, really appreciate it. Thanks for your interest in birds. Oh, thanks, I don't see your email. Okay, so let me just do that. Let me just do this. Actually, let me do this. I'm gonna just put it back up there again. Can you guys see that? Oh, so somebody down, yes, you're very welcome. I'm really glad that this is you still can't see that. The chat here again. You
can type it into the chat.
Oh, the chat, sorry, right. Okay, we'll do that. We'll do that. Is all panelists gonna get that answer to everybody, or does it need to be all participants?
All panelists and attendees.
I think I got it. And then I thought somebody asked, are people putting GPS transmitters on birds? And yes, they are. And that is sort of an evolving thing. And one of the things that the challenges we face is, yeah, so with a new technique, people want to take advantage of that. I think one of the challenges is trying to design good studies ahead of time to how to best take advantage of those data. That said, sometimes it's hard to design a study when you're not really sure how these things are going to work. Just swing back to the Q&A and make sure there's nobody here I missed. Yeah, thanks for your interest in birding and bird science. I hope you guys have a great Balticon. I know that it's really disappointing. I know folks are disappointed in not being able to see their friends in person. And just thanks for stepping up and participating in this remotely. So how's the data used? Yeah, so right. I think that might be in reference to the GPS data. Yeah, I think people are still working on that. You can, like I said, you can determine from radio transmitter data, you can determine survival directly, and very often you'll be able to determine the specific fate, the cause of mortality for birds, especially for birds that, you can determine cause specific mortality, and that can be really useful. And hopefully you guys got my email. Let's see, here's chat. You're very welcome. Thanks very much for attending. Elizabeth. Hope I pronounced your name correctly. Thank you, Michael. Thanks, Krista, Archer, all y'all. Thank you. Yeah, so Jerry wants to know how many are being tracked, and that's going to be so as far as I know, nobody in my specific branch is involved with that right now. So it may be a lot of researchers at universities, some state agencies are using them. Again, the challenge becomes are there ways to coordinate across research efforts? There's something called the MODIS network where it's a array of towers they'd like to be able to build up that are tracking some of these MODIS transmitters and hopefully being able to get some more broad scale information and some facilitate sharing data across different studies. Have all birds in general declined? No, not all birds. Some of them, some have. We've seen huge declines in grassland songbirds. Forest interior birds have been a concern for a number of years. Those are the ones that come to mind. Most waterfowl are doing very well. Some birds, especially those that are do well with in human affected habitats, are doing great, which is fine. That's good. It's great. But yes, in general, there's just been a pretty well cited study that tries to at least tries to roughly estimate causes of mortality.
Thank you very much, Pam.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Thank you for hosting and facilitating, and thank you everybody for attending. Really appreciate it.